He said it loud enough for the entire room to hear, as if humiliation was a performance and she was the stage. Emily Carter stood frozen beneath the chandelier's golden glow, the crystal light scattering across the marble floor like fragments of a life already breaking. Her fingers wrapped tightly around a half-empty champagne flute she didn't remember picking up. Her heart beat loud, uneven, almost drowning out the low hum of polite laughter that followed his words. Because Daniel Brooks didn't just leave her that night. He made sure everyone knew he was done with her. The party had been meant to celebrate his promotion. A sleek downtown penthouse filled with tailored suits, silk dresses, and the quiet arrogance of success. The kind of place where appearances mattered more than truth, and Emily had spent hours making sure she looked like she belonged there. Smoothing down the navy dress she could barely afford, practicing a smile that wouldn't tremble, telling herself that love meant standing beside him, even when she felt small. But standing there now, under the weight of his cold gaze, she realized she had never truly been beside him, only behind him, slightly out of frame, like a detail no one bothered to notice. "You're holding me back," Daniel said, his voice calm, measured, almost bored, as if he were discussing a minor inconvenience instead of dismantling a marriage in real time. And the woman beside him, polished, effortless, said nothing, only adjusted her diamond bracelet and watched, her silence louder than any insult. Emily felt the room tilt, the scent of expensive cologne and aged whiskey suddenly too sharp, too suffocating. And for a moment she thought she might cry, the old instinct rising, the one he had trained in her, but stopped somewhere in her chest, caught between pride and something colder, something quieter. Around her, conversations resumed, soft and dismissive, as if her unraveling was just another passing moment in a long, forgettable evening. And she realized then that no one was going to step in, no one was going to save her, not from him, not from this, not from herself. Daniel turned away before she could respond, already moving toward the future he had chosen, his laughter blending seamlessly back into the rhythm of the party, leaving her standing alone in a room that had never been hers. The glass in. Her hand trembled once before she set it down on a passing tray, her movements slow, deliberate, as if each second was being carved into memory. And when she finally walked toward the door, no one stopped her, no one noticed, and maybe that was the cruelest part of all. Outside, the city air was sharp against her skin, the distant sound of traffic grounding her in something real, something solid. And for the first time that night, she took a full breath, her shoulders rising, then falling, as the weight of what had just happened settled into something undeniable. He didn't just leave her. He erased her, stripped her down to nothing in a room full of witnesses, and as she stepped off the curb into the quiet glow of the streetlights, there was no dramatic vow, no whispered promise of revenge, only a silence that felt heavier than words, a stillness that carried something dangerous within it. Because in that moment, the woman Daniel had just discarded ceased to exist, and somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the ache, something else began to take shape. Something patient, something unbreakable, something the world hadn't seen yet, and that was the last moment anyone would ever see the old Emily. The first night alone felt louder than the party he had left her in. The silence in Emily Carter's small apartment stretching across the narrow living room like something alive, pressing against her ribs with every breath she took. The hum of an old refrigerator replacing the polished chatter of penthouse conversations. And for a while she stood there without turning on the lights, as if darkness could soften the truth that had followed her home. Because when everything is stripped away, what remains is not just loss, it is clarity, and clarity can be cruel. The days that followed did not arrive with sudden transformation or cinematic triumph. They came slowly, one after another, measured in small, unremarkable choices, early mornings where she forced herself out of bed before the weight of memory could pin her down, long walks through unfamiliar streets where no one knew her name, and hours spent relearning things she had once loved before they were dismissed as unimportant, before she was told they did not matter. She found work where she could, modest, quiet, the kind of work that did not impress anyone but demanded everything from her. And with each passing week, something subtle began to shift, not in the world around her, but within her, a steadiness replacing the fragile version of confidence she had once borrowed from someone else. She stopped checking her phone for messages that would never come, stopped replaying his voice in her head, and instead began to listen to her own, softer at first, but growing stronger with every decision she made without asking for permission. It was in one of those ordinary afternoons, seated in a sunlit corner of a modest co-working space that smelled faintly of coffee and paper, that she first noticed Alexander Hayes, not because he demanded attention, but because he did not, his presence calm, almost deliberate, like a man who had nothing to prove and no need to perform. And when their paths crossed, it was not dramatic, no sudden spark or grand introduction, just a conversation that felt unexpectedly real, grounded in substance, rather than pretense. He asked questions no one had asked her in years, not about who she was with, but about what she was building, what she believed in, what she wanted beyond survival. And for a moment she hesitated, the old instinct to diminish herself rising again. But then she answered honestly, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not pity, but recognition. Their interactions remained measured, professional, yet quietly significant, opportunities appearing not as gifts, but as doors she still had to choose to walk through. And each time she did, she carried herself a little differently, her steps more certain, her voice more steady, until the woman who had once stood frozen beneath a chandelier began to feel like a distant memory rather than a permanent identity. The transformation was not loud. It did not announce itself to the world. There were no dramatic reveals or public validations, only a growing sense of ownership over her own life, a realization that power was not something given, but something built patiently, piece by piece, in moments no one else ever sees. And somewhere along the way, without her noticing exactly when it happened, Emily stopped surviving and started becoming, not the woman he had left behind, but someone entirely new, someone who did not need to be chosen to have value, someone who understood that the silence she once feared was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, and in that quiet, something far greater than revenge was taking shape, something that did not rush, did not seek attention, but waited, knowing that when the time came, it would not need to announce itself, because the world would feel it the moment she returned. The sound reached the rooftop before the jet came into view, a low, distant thunder that made conversations pause and heads turn upward toward the fading amber sky. And Daniel Brooks, standing at the center of his carefully curated success, felt a flicker of irritation at the interruption. His glass of whiskey held steady in his hand as laughter lingered around him, because tonight was supposed to be perfect, the deal of the year within reach, the kind of moment he had once believed defined a man, and yet something in the air shifted, subtle at first, then undeniable, as the sleek silhouette of a private jet cut across the skyline and descended with quiet authority onto the nearby private runway, reserved for the city's most powerful names. The rooftop buzz softened into curiosity, whispers threading through the crowd as people checked their phones, speculating, recalibrating, because arrivals like this did not go unnoticed. Not here, not among people who measured worth in access and proximity. And Daniel forced a smile, masking the faint tension settling into his chest, telling himself it was nothing, just another display of wealth, just another reminder that there was always someone higher, someone richer, someone more important. And yet when the elevator doors opened moments later, the shift became something else entirely. She stepped out not with haste, not seeking attention, but with a calm that commanded it anyway. Emily Carter moving through the space as if she had always belonged there, her presence quiet yet impossible to ignore, the soft white silk of her dress catching the city lights, her posture steady, her gaze level, and for a heartbeat that stretched longer than it should have, the room fell into a kind of suspended silence, the kind that happens when expectation collides with something no one prepared for. Daniel's smile faltered before he could stop it, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman in front of him with the memory he had long since filed away, because the Emily he remembered had been uncertain, searching, shaped by his approval, but the woman. Walking toward him now carried none of that, only a stillness that felt like control, like something earned rather than given. Beside her, Alexander Hayes moved with the same quiet authority, his presence known without announcement. And when someone near the bar recognized him, the ripple spread quickly, a shift in tone, in posture, in attention, as the room adjusted to accommodate a different level of power. And it was then, in that precise moment, that Daniel understood this was no coincidence, no chance encounter, but something far more deliberate. Conversations faded as Alexander stopped at the center of the gathering, his voice calm, measured, cutting cleanly through the ambient noise as he addressed the host, acknowledging the event, the deal, the future that everyone in the room had been so eager to secure. And then, almost as an afterthought yet with unmistakable clarity, he turned slightly, his hand resting lightly at Emily's back, and introduced her not as a guest, not as a companion, but as his partner, the principal decision maker behind the investment that would determine everything. The words settled into the room like gravity, shifting the entire balance of power in an instant. And Daniel felt it physically, the ground beneath his confidence giving way to something unsteady, something unfamiliar, because the narrative he had built, the version of her he had believed in, no longer existed, and in its place stood someone he did not understand, someone he could not control. Emily's gaze met his briefly, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm recognition, as if he were simply a part of a story she had already moved beyond. And then she looked away, her attention returning to the conversation, to the future unfolding around her, leaving him standing exactly where he had once left her, except now. It was he who felt out of place, out of step, and entirely unseen. She had not come back to prove anything. She had not come back to confront or to reclaim. She had simply arrived. And in doing so, she had redefined everything, because the woman he thought he had erased had not only rewritten her life, she had become the outcome he never saw coming. And this time, there was nothing he could say that would change it. There was a moment, almost imperceptible, when the energy of the room recalibrated itself. Around her, as if an invisible axis had shifted and everyone present instinctively felt it. The quiet hum of conversation no longer orbiting Daniel Brooks, but subtly, undeniably drawn toward Emily Carter, and she noticed it not with surprise, but with the calm awareness of someone who had already lived this moment 1,000 times in her mind, rehearsed not in words, but in composure, in the steady rhythm of her breath, in the deliberate stillness of her posture as she listened rather than performed. The city lights stretched beyond the glass walls like a living constellation, reflecting softly against the polished surfaces of the rooftop. And for the first time, she did not feel like she was looking at a world she needed to earn her place in. She felt like she belonged to it in a way that required no permission, no validation, no borrowed identity. Across the room, Daniel remained where he was, though everything about him had subtly changed, the ease in his stance replaced by something tighter, more calculated, his gaze returning to her again and again, as if searching for a flaw, a crack, any trace of the woman he once knew. But there was none, only a version of her that existed entirely outside his understanding, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. He took a step forward at last, as if drawn by something he could not quite name, weaving through the shifting clusters of guests until he stood within speaking distance. The familiar scent of his cologne faint in the air, a detail that might have once unraveled her, but now barely registered. And when he spoke her name, it carried a hesitation that had never been there before, softer, uncertain, almost careful, as if he were approaching something fragile, though there was nothing fragile about her anymore. Emily turned toward him fully this time, her expression composed, her gaze steady, and for a brief second, time folded in on itself, the past and present colliding in the space between them. But only one of them felt it. Only one of them remained tethered to what had been, because she had already stepped beyond it. "You look different," he said, the words falling short of what he meant, because what he saw could not be explained by appearance alone. It was something deeper, something structural, as if the foundation of who she was had been rebuilt entirely. She held his gaze without urgency, without the need to fill the silence, allowing the weight of the moment to settle naturally. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying none of the tremor he once expected. "I am," she said simply, and there was no explanation beyond that. No justification, no invitation for further questions. The simplicity of her answer left him with nowhere to go, no angle to regain control. And for the first time, he realized that whatever connection they once had no longer granted him access to her, not to her thoughts, not to her life, not even to her attention. Behind her, the conversation with Alexander continued seamlessly, numbers and strategies unfolding with quiet precision, decisions being shaped in real time. And Daniel understood, with a clarity that arrived too late to matter, that the outcome of his carefully constructed future no longer rested in his hands, but in hers, and yet she did not use that power to diminish him, did not mirror the humiliation he had once delivered so easily. She simply existed within it, effortlessly, as if it had always been hers. The realization settled into him slowly, heavier with each passing second, that the silence she offered was not absence. It was resolution, a closing of something he could not reopen. And as she turned away once more, returning to the conversation that would define everything that followed, he was left standing in the echo of his own past choices, understanding at last that the moment he thought had ended her had only begun something far greater, something he had never been meant to be part of. And that was the only answer he would ever get. The deal did not close with applause or celebration. It settled in a place quietly, like a final piece sliding into a structure that had already been decided long before anyone in the room realized it. And as the last signatures were exchanged and the conversations shifted toward future collaborations, Emily Carter remained exactly as she had been all evening, composed, attentive, never once raising her voice or claiming the spotlight that had naturally found her, because power, she had learned, did not need to announce itself to be felt. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, its lights flickering like distant possibilities, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to stand still within it all, not as someone who had arrived, but as someone who had already built something lasting, something no one could take from her, not again. Alexander Hayes stood beside her, his presence steady, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them that required no words, a recognition of mutual respect rather than dependency. And when he spoke to others, he did not speak for her. He spoke with her, a subtle difference that reshaped every interaction, reinforcing what everyone in the room had already begun to understand. Across the space, Daniel Brooks lingered at the edge of conversations that no longer centered around him, his confidence eroded not by confrontation, but by absence, by the realization that he was no longer the axis around which things moved. And when he glanced toward Emily one last time, it was not with arrogance or dismissal, but with something quieter, something closer to recognition, as if he were finally seeing her without the distortion of his own expectations and understanding, too late, that the version of her he had once dismissed had never been the full picture. Emily noticed the look, but it did not reach her in the way it once would have. It did not stir old emotions or reopen closed spaces. It simply existed, another detail in a moment that no longer belonged to him. And as she turned away, the distance between who she had been and who she had become felt complete, not because of him, but because of everything she had done in the silence after he left. The night began to wind down in the subtle way these gatherings always did. Conversations softening, glasses emptying, the city outside continuing its endless motion. And as Emily made her way toward the elevator, there was no dramatic exit, no lingering glance back, only a calm, deliberate movement forward, her heels echoing softly against polished floors, each step grounded, certain, entirely her own. The doors opened with a quiet chime, and as she stepped inside, the reflection staring back at her in the mirrored walls was no longer someone searching for validation, no longer someone shaped by someone else's definition of worth, but a woman who had faced the moment meant to break her and turned it into something else entirely, something stronger, something unshakable. As the elevator descended, the distant sound of the city rising to meet her, there was no need for a final statement, no need to reclaim what had been lost, because nothing about her journey had been about returning. It had always been about becoming. And in that quiet, steady descent, one truth remained clear. She had not come back for revenge. She had become something far more powerful than that, something that did not look back, did not linger, did not need to prove anything at all. And somewhere above, in a room now filled with the echoes of a life he could no longer reach, Daniel Brooks finally understood that the moment he thought had ended her had been the moment he lost her forever. Not to another man, not to another life, but to the version of herself she had chosen to become, and that was something no one could ever take away. The city did not pause for her. It never had. But as Emily Carter stepped out into the cool night air, the quiet hum of traffic and distant sirens felt different now. No longer overwhelming. No longer something she had to fight against just to be heard, but something she moved through with a calm certainty that had taken months to build and years to understand. And as the black car waited at the curb, its engine running low and steady, she did not rush. She did not look back. She simply walked forward, her reflection briefly catching in the dark glass of nearby buildings, a fleeting image of someone who had finally become whole without needing to prove it to anyone. Inside the car, the world softened, the noise fading into a distant rhythm as the door closed behind her, and for the first time that evening, she allowed her shoulders to relax, not out of exhaustion, but out of completion, the kind that does not come from winning or losing, but from knowing you no longer need the outcome to validate your existence. And across from her, Alexander Hayes watched quietly, not with curiosity, not with expectation, but with a kind of understanding that had never demanded anything from her, his presence steady, grounded, as if he had known all along that this moment would come, not because he created it, but because she did. "You handled that exactly as you needed to," he said after a moment, his voice low, measured, not praise, not evaluation, simply observation, and Emily allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not directed at him, but the truth within his words, because there had been a time when she would have questioned herself, replayed every glance, every silence, every step, searching for mistakes, searching for approval. But now there was none of that. Only a quiet confidence that did not need to be confirmed. "It was never about him," she replied, her voice calm, the words settling into the space between them with a weight that felt both final and freeing. And as the car moved through the city streets, the lights passing in soft, rhythmic patterns across the interior, she realized how far she had come from the woman who once stood outside in the cold, unsure where to go next, unsure of who she was without someone else defining her. Back at the rooftop, the absence she left behind lingered longer than her presence had, conversations returning, but never quite the same, a subtle awareness threading through every interaction that something had shifted, that the balance of power they all quietly navigated had been rewritten without announcement. And Daniel Brooks remained among them, but no longer at the center, his movements measured, his words more careful, as if he were trying to recalibrate in a space that no longer responded to him in the way it once had. He replayed the moment again and again, her voice, her stillness, the way she had looked at him without needing anything, and it unsettled him not because of what she had done, but because of what she had not done. She had not confronted him, had not demanded recognition, had not tried to reclaim anything from the past, and in that absence of reaction, he found himself facing something far more difficult than anger. He was facing irrelevance. The realization settled slowly, heavy and unyielding, that the version of her he had once controlled no longer existed in any form he could reach, and that whatever she had become was not shaped by him, not defined by him, but entirely separate, entirely beyond his influence. And for the first time, he understood that what he had lost was not just a person, but the illusion of control he had built his life around. As the car carried Emily farther into the night, the city unfolding endlessly before her, there was no sense of arrival, no final destination waiting to be claimed, only a continuation, a life that no longer revolved around proving anything to anyone. And as she looked out through the window, the reflection that met her gaze was steady, composed, and entirely her own, a quiet reminder that everything she had built did not need an audience to exist. And that was the most powerful truth she had ever learned. Morning arrived without ceremony, the soft gray light slipping through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Emily Carter's apartment, touching the edges of a life that no longer felt borrowed or temporary. And as she stood there with a cup of coffee warming her hands, the city below already in motion, she realized something quiet but profound had shifted, not overnight, not in a single defining moment, but in the accumulation of choices she had made when no one was watching, when no one was applauding, when it would have been easier to disappear instead of rebuild. The reflection in the glass was steady, familiar now in a way it had never been before. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest, unfiltered by anyone else's expectations. And for a moment she allowed herself to remember the woman who once stood in a different apartment, waiting for someone else to come home, measuring her worth in how she was seen rather than how she lived. And the contrast did not sting the way it once might have. It simply existed as proof of distance traveled. Her phone buzzed softly against the marble countertop, a message from her assistant outlining the day ahead, meetings, decisions, opportunities that required her attention, and she read it without urgency, without the familiar rush of needing to prove she deserved to be there, because now she knew she did. Across the city, in an office that felt both familiar and strangely smaller than it once had, Daniel Brooks sat at his desk, the skyline framed behind him in a view he had once considered a symbol of arrival. But this morning it felt different, less like a victory and more like a question he could not quite answer, his mind returning, uninvited, to the night before, to the way she had stood, the way she had spoken. Or more precisely, the way she had not needed to say much at all. He tried to focus on the numbers in front of him, the projections, the strategy, the next steps that had once come easily, but something had shifted there as well, a subtle disruption in the narrative he had built for himself. And for the first time, he found himself questioning not just what he had lost, but what he had misunderstood from the beginning. Emily, meanwhile, moved through her morning with a quiet efficiency, the rhythm of her steps grounded, intentional, each decision made with clarity rather than hesitation. And when she arrived at her office, the space reflected the same understated confidence she carried, clean lines, natural light, a place designed not to impress, but to function, to create, to build something that lasted beyond appearances. Alexander Hayes was already there, reviewing documents, his presence as steady as ever, and when he looked up, there was no surprise in his expression, only a simple acknowledgement of continuity, of work that moved forward regardless of yesterday's events. "We have a decision to finalize," he said, his tone even, and Emily nodded, stepping into the conversation seamlessly, her focus shifting not to what had been, but to what was next, because that was where her energy belonged now. Hours passed in a series of discussions that required precision, insight, and a kind of quiet authority that could not be imitated. And as she spoke, as she listened, as she made choices that would ripple far beyond the room, there was no trace of the woman who once doubted her voice, only someone who understood its value and used it carefully. Back in his office, Daniel found himself staring out at the same city, but seeing it differently, the realization settling deeper with each passing minute that the world had not changed around him. He had simply failed to see it clearly before, and now that clarity came with a cost he could not reverse. And somewhere between those two spaces, between what was and what could have been, the truth remained simple and undeniable. Emily Carter was no longer a part of the story. She was writing her own, and this time there was no place in it for the version of her he had once believed he controlled. By the time the second week passed, the ripple from that night had spread far beyond the rooftop where it began, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore, the kind of shift that did not announce itself but quietly rearranged the way people spoke, the way they listened, the way they remembered, and Emily Carter noticed it not through headlines or public recognition, but in the way doors opened before she reached them, in the tone of conversations that carried a different weight when her name was mentioned, not as someone attached to a past, but as someone shaping what came next. The boardroom that afternoon was lined with glass and steel, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond it, and as she took her seat at the long polished table, the room settled into a focused silence that had nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with respect, a respect she had not demanded, had not chased, but had built, decision by decision, moment by moment, long before anyone thought to acknowledge it. Alexander Hayes sat across from her, reviewing the final projections, his presence unchanged, steady as ever. But there was a subtle shift in how others engaged, their attention no longer orbiting him alone, but expanding to include her naturally, as if the balance between them had always existed this way, as if it made sense that she was not standing beside power, but sharing it. Emily listened more than she spoke, her gaze moving from one speaker to another, absorbing, measuring, understanding not just the numbers but the intentions behind them. And when she did speak, it was with clarity, with precision, the kind that did not leave room for doubt, and the effect was immediate, the room adjusting, recalibrating around her words, not because they were louder, but because they were certain. Across the city, Daniel Brooks found himself in a similar room, but the atmosphere was different, thinner somehow, conversations that once flowed easily now requiring effort, his voice still confident, but lacking the unchallenged authority it once carried. And though no one said it directly, the absence of something unspoken lingered, a quiet awareness that the landscape had shifted and he had not been the one to shape it. He glanced at his phone more often than he would admit, not expecting a message, but searching for something he could not quite define, some indication that the moment on that rooftop had been an exception, rather than a turning point. But there was nothing, only the steady continuation of a reality that no longer revolved around him. Back in the boardroom, the decision was finalized with a calm certainty, signatures exchanged, agreements sealed, and, as the meeting concluded, there was no burst of celebration, no need for it. Only a quiet acknowledgement that something significant had been accomplished, something that would extend far beyond the walls of that room. And Emily rose from her seat with the same composed grace she had carried throughout. Her movements unhurried, grounded, entirely her own. As she stepped out into the corridor, the natural light catching briefly in her hair, she felt it again, that quiet sense of alignment, of being exactly where she needed to be, not because someone had placed her there, but because she had built the path herself, piece by piece, when no one else was paying attention. And somewhere in that unfolding, beyond the numbers and the deals and the shifting dynamics of power, there was a deeper realization taking hold, one that did not need to be spoken to be understood, that everything she had become was not a reaction to what she had lost, but a result of what she had chosen to build in the silence after it. And that was something no one could ever take away. The invitation arrived without urgency. A simple cream envelope placed neatly among the rest of Emily Carter's correspondence, its weight unassuming, its presence almost easy to overlook. But the moment her eyes traced the embossed lettering, she understood exactly what it was, not just another event, not just another gathering of polished conversations and curated appearances, but something else entirely. Something that carried the faint echo of a life she had already outgrown. She turned it over in her hand slowly, the texture smooth beneath her fingertips, her expression unchanged, yet somewhere beneath that stillness, a quiet recognition settled, not of fear, not of anticipation, but of completion waiting to happen. Across the city, Daniel Brooks received the same invitation, though for him it felt different, heavier somehow, as if the paper itself carried a question he could not ignore, his fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary before setting it down on his desk, his reflection faint in the dark surface, a man who had once moved through these spaces with certainty. Now pausing, recalculating, unsure of what version of himself would be required this time. The event was set to take place at a historic estate just outside the city, the kind of place where legacy was not just discussed but displayed, where every detail whispered of permanence. And, as the day approached, the anticipation surrounding it grew quietly, not loud enough to draw attention, but present enough to be felt by those who understood its significance. When the evening finally arrived, the estate was illuminated in soft golden light. The long driveway, lined with black cars arriving one after another, guests stepping out in tailored suits and elegant dresses, their conversations low, measured, each one carrying their own expectations into the night. Emily's car arrived without spectacle, the door opening with a quiet ease as she stepped out, her presence composed, her movements unhurried, the deep sapphire of her dress catching the light in a way that did not demand attention, yet held it effortlessly. And as she walked toward the entrance, there was no sense of returning, only a continuation of a path she had already chosen. Inside, the air carried the subtle scent of polished wood and distant music, the kind of atmosphere designed to impress without appearing to try. And as Emily moved through the space, greetings met her with a familiarity that had nothing to do with her past and everything to do with who she had become, a quiet acknowledgement from those who recognized substance over spectacle. Daniel arrived shortly after, his presence still drawing attention, but it was different now, less centered, more observed, as if the room was no longer adjusting to him, but simply including him among many. And when he stepped inside, his eyes instinctively searched the space, not out of curiosity, but out of something deeper, something closer to awareness. It did not take long for him to find her, standing near a tall window overlooking the gardens, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the evening lights, her posture relaxed, her presence grounded in a way that made everything around her feel slightly less significant. And for a moment he did not move, did not speak. He simply stood there, recognizing the distance between who she had been and who she now was, a distance that could not be crossed by memory or intention. Conversations flowed around them, the evening unfolding with its usual rhythm. But beneath it all, something else lingered, something unspoken yet understood, that this was not just another gathering, not just another night of appearances, but a quiet convergence of past and present, of what had been and what had become. And as Emily turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room without urgency, without search, there was no trace of hesitation, only a calm certainty that whatever this night held, she was already beyond it, already complete within herself, and that made all the difference. The music softened as the evening deepened, the kind of subtle shift that only those paying attention would notice, conversations lowering in volume, movements slowing as if the entire estate was holding its breath for something not yet announced, and Emily Carter felt it before she saw it, that quiet tightening in the air that always came before a moment that mattered. She stood near the window, the cool glass at her back, the gardens beyond lit by soft amber lights that traced the pathways like something out of memory rather than reality, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to be still within it, not preparing, not anticipating, simply present in a way she had learned to be when control was no longer something she needed to grasp. Across the room, Daniel Brooks felt it too, though for him it carried a different weight, a tension that settled into his shoulders, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly as he adjusted his jacket, his eyes scanning the room with a focus that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with awareness. Because somewhere beneath the surface of the evening, he understood that something was about to unfold, something that would not revolve around him, and that realization alone was enough to unsettle him. A voice rose near the center of the room, calm, authoritative, drawing attention without effort as the host stepped forward to address the gathering, the tone polite yet deliberate, signaling a transition from casual conversation to something more structured, more significant. And as the room gradually quieted, glasses lowering, heads turning, Emily shifted her gaze toward the center, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if she had already accepted whatever was about to come. The announcement began simply a reflection on partnerships, on vision, on the future being shaped by those. Willing to see beyond the immediate, words that flowed easily, comfortably, yet carried a deeper intention beneath them. And as the host continued, the direction of that intention became clearer, the focus narrowing. the language more precise, until finally, with a slight turn of the body and a gesture that was both subtle and unmistakable, the attention of the entire room was guided toward her. There was no dramatic pause, no exaggerated build-up, only a quiet, definitive moment where expectation met reality. And in that space, Emily did not move immediately, did not rush to fill it. She allowed it to exist, to settle, to be felt fully before she stepped forward, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor, each step measured, unhurried, entirely controlled. The introduction was brief, almost understated, yet its impact moved through the room like a shift in gravity. Her name spoken not in relation to anyone else, not as an extension of a past identity, but as the central figure behind a series of decisions that had already begun to reshape the landscape everyone in the room operated within. And as those words settled, as recognition replaced assumption, the subtle recalibration that followed was immediate, visible in the way people stood, in the way they looked at her, in the way they understood, all at once, that the narrative they had carried into this evening no longer applied. Daniel felt it more than anyone. The moment where perception broke and something clearer took its place, his mind catching up to a reality he had not anticipated. And as he watched her step fully into that space, not seeking validation, not acknowledging the shift, simply existing within it, as if it had always been hers, he realized that whatever he had believed about her, whatever role he had assigned her in his understanding of the world, had been incomplete from the start. Emily met the room with a calm that did not demand attention, yet held it effortlessly. Her voice steady when she spoke, her words precise, measured, carrying the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to be heard to know her voice mattered. And in that moment, there was no trace of the woman he had once left behind, only someone who had taken everything that had been dismissed, everything that had been overlooked, and turned it into something undeniable. And as the room settled around her, as the weight of that realization took hold, one truth became impossible to ignore. She had not returned to reclaim anything. She had arrived as something entirely new, something that did not belong to the past at all, and that was the moment everything changed. The silence that followed her words was not empty. It was full, dense with realization, with recalibration, with the quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had just taken place, and Emily Carter stood within it without shifting, without filling the space, allowing it to settle exactly as it needed to, because she understood now that the most powerful moments were not the ones you forced, but the ones you allowed to unfold on their own. Around her, the room adjusted in subtle ways, shoulders straightening, expressions sharpening, conversations that had once carried a certain tone now shifting into something more measured, more intentional, as if everyone present was rewriting their understanding in real time, aligning themselves with a reality that no longer matched their assumptions. Across the room, Daniel Brooks felt the weight of that shift more acutely than anyone, not because it was directed at him, but because it exposed something he had never questioned before, the certainty he had built his identity on, the belief that he understood the roles people played in his world. And as he watched her, truly watched her this time, he realized how incomplete that understanding had always been. She was not standing there to prove him wrong. She was not standing there to confront or to reclaim. She was simply existing in a space he had never imagined she could occupy. And that simplicity made it impossible to challenge, impossible to dismiss. He took a step forward again, not out of confidence this time, but out of something quieter, something closer to the need for clarity, for confirmation that what he was seeing was real, that this was not some temporary shift in perception, but a permanent redefinition of everything he thought he knew. "Emily," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the certainty it once carried. And when she turned toward him, there was no resistance, no hesitation, only a calm acknowledgement of his presence, as if he were simply another part of the room, no more significant, no less. For a moment, the noise of the evening faded into the background, the distant music, the low conversations, all of it softening as the space between them narrowed. And in that space, there was no tension, no unresolved conflict, only a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity. "I did not expect this," he admitted, the words careful, measured, as if he were choosing each one with more thought than he ever had before, and Emily listened without interruption, without the need to respond immediately, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. "You were never supposed to," she replied, her voice even, not cold, not distant, but grounded in something that did not require his understanding to be valid, and the truth of it settled between them with a finality that could not be undone. He searched her expression for something more, some indication that there was still a connection he could reach, some fragment of the past that might still belong to him. But there was nothing there that invited it, nothing that suggested she was waiting for anything from him at all. Behind her, the evening continued, the world moving forward as it always did, indifferent to individual realizations. And in that movement, in that continuation, Daniel understood something he had never considered before, that the absence of reaction was not indifference. It was completion. It was the closing of a chapter that no longer required revisiting. Emily gave a slight nod, not as a dismissal, not as a gesture of finality, but as an acknowledgement that the moment had reached its natural end. And as she turned away once more, rejoining the conversations that shaped the future rather than the past, she did so without hesitation, without looking back, because there was nothing left behind that belonged to her anymore. And as Daniel remained where he stood, the realization settling deeper with each passing second, one truth became impossible to ignore. He had not lost her in the way he once believed. He had lost the version of her that existed within his control, and in its place stood someone entirely beyond it, someone who did not need to be understood to be undeniable, and that was something he could never reclaim. The evening did not end with a dramatic climax. It unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled from something that no longer held its original shape, conversations softening into quieter tones, guests drifting toward the exits. In small, measured groups, each carrying with them a slightly altered understanding of what they had witnessed, and Emily Carter moved through it all with the same steady composure she had carried from the moment she arrived. Her presence no longer an interruption, but a constant, something the room had adjusted to rather than questioned. The estate grounds stretched beyond the tall windows, illuminated by soft golden lights that traced the edges of carefully manicured paths, and as she stepped outside for a brief moment, the cool night air settling gently against her skin, there was a stillness that felt earned, not the absence of noise, but the presence of peace, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to reclaim. Behind her, the doors opened and closed in quiet intervals, the echo of footsteps fading in and out, and when Alexander Hayes joined her, his presence familiar, grounded, it did not shift the moment. It simply existed within it, as natural as the rhythm of the evening itself. "You did not need to say much," he observed, his voice low, almost blending with the distant sounds of the estate, and Emily allowed herself a small breath, her gaze moving across the gardens, the lights, the space that felt both temporary and complete. "There was nothing left to say," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else that had been spoken that night, because it was true, not just about him, not just about the past, but about everything she had once believed she needed to explain, to justify, to defend. Inside, Daniel Brooks remained longer than most, though he could not have explained why. His steps slower, his interactions more deliberate, as if he were trying to anchor himself in a space that no longer responded to him in the way it once had. And as he moved through the remaining conversations, he found himself listening more than speaking, observing more than directing, a quiet shift that felt unfamiliar, yet unavoidable. The image of her lingered in his mind, not as a question, not as a regret he could easily name, but as a realization that extended beyond a single moment, beyond a single choice, something deeper, something structural, the understanding that the version of success he had built his life around had never included the possibility that he might misjudge someone so completely, and now that understanding sat with him, steady, unchanging, refusing to be ignored. Emily turned back toward the entrance after a moment, her steps measured as she re-entered the space, not to seek anything, not to complete anything, but simply because the night had not fully ended yet, and there was no urgency to leave, no need to escape, only a quiet continuation of something that had already resolved itself internally. As she passed through the room, a few remaining guests acknowledged her with subtle nods, brief exchanges that carried respect without excess, and she returned them with the same calm presence, never lingering, never performing, because she no longer needed to be seen to know that she was. When she finally made her way toward the exit, the movement felt natural, unforced, the evening settling behind her like a chapter that had reached its final line without needing a dramatic conclusion, and as the doors closed softly behind her, the estate returning to its quiet glow, one truth remained, clear and unwavering. She had not come back to change how anyone saw her. She had come back already changed. And that was something no moment, no person, no past could undo. The night gave way to morning without asking permission, the skies softening from deep indigo to a pale, quiet blue as the city stretched awake beneath it, and Emily Carter stood once more by the window, the same place where so much had shifted without spectacle, without noise, her reflection steady in the glass, unchanged from the night before, and yet entirely different from the woman she had once been. Because what had transformed was not something the world could immediately see. It was something deeper, something anchored in the way she moved through her own life now, without hesitation, without the need to look over her shoulder. The events of the evening lingered not as a memory she replayed, but as something already integrated, already settled, a moment that had closed itself without leaving loose ends. And as she lifted her coffee, the warmth grounding, familiar, she understood that there was no final victory to claim, no moment of triumph to hold on to, only a quiet continuation of everything she had built when no one was watching. Across the city, Daniel Brooks stood in a similar stillness, though his felt different, heavier, as if the clarity that had arrived for him had not yet settled into something stable, his reflection in the glass of his office unfamiliar in a way he could not quite explain, because for the first time he was seeing himself without the assumptions that had once defined him, without the certainty that he understood the people in his life, and the realization did not come with drama. It came with silence, with the absence of something he could no longer name. He thought of her not as the person he had left behind, but as the person who had stood in front of him, composed, complete, untouched by anything he had once believed would define her. And in that understanding, there was no path back, no version of events where he could step into that story again, because it was no longer his to enter. Emily set her cup down and turned from the window, the city continuing its endless rhythm beyond her, meetings waiting, decisions to be made, a life that moved forward without needing to pause for reflection. And as she gathered her things, there was a lightness in her steps that had nothing to do with ease and everything to do with certainty, the kind that comes from knowing you are no longer carrying anything that does not belong to you. The past had not been erased. It had simply lost its hold, its ability to shape her direction. And in its place was something far more enduring, a sense of self that did not depend on circumstance, on approval, on proximity to anyone else. The world would continue as it always did, shifting, evolving, presenting new challenges and new opportunities, but she would meet it as she was now, not as who she had once been, and that was the difference that mattered. Somewhere in the distance, a plane crossed the sky, its path steady, unwavering, a quiet reminder of movement, of distance traveled, of destinations that were not defined by where you started. And as Emily stepped into her day, there was no need for a final glance back, no need for closure beyond what she already carried within her, because the story had never been about returning to where she had been. It had always been about becoming someone who no longer needed to. And in that quiet, undeniable truth, everything else fell into place exactly as it was meant to,